7:40 on the morning of March 23, 2021, a container ship enters the southern section of the Suez Canal. She is the Ever Given, 400 meters long, 224,000 tons, loaded with 20,000 steel boxes stacked 12 high on her deck. The boxes hold flat-pack furniture from China, auto parts from Taiwan, electronics bound for Rotterdam, medical equipment for hospitals in Germany. From the bridge, her captain can see the bank of the canal less than 30 meters off each beam. The wind is wrong this morning. A sandstorm called a khamsin is moving up from the Gulf of Suez, and the air around the ship is the color of weak tea. Visibility drops. The Egyptian pilots aboard the bridge adjust course. The ship is making 13.5 knots, nearly twice the speed recommended for transit through the narrow southern reach of the canal. At 7:42, she loses her heading. The bow swings east, the stern swings west. The rudder answers, and then it does not. The Ever Given turns 90 degrees across the canal and drives her bow into the eastern bank with a force that can be felt from ships 4 kilometers away. She comes to rest, wedged between the 2 continents she was trying to sail between. Her bow is in Asia, her stern is in Africa, and behind her, in both directions, a line of ships begins to form. A line that will, within 6 days, reach over 400 vessels and tie up $9.6 billion in global trade for every day she refuses to move. This is the moment a single ship, caught sideways in a narrow stretch of artificial water, becomes the most expensive traffic jam in human history. And most of the world in that moment realizes they did not know the Suez Canal was there, or what it was, until it stopped working. The canal she is stuck in is 193 kilometers long. It cuts through an Egyptian desert that has existed for tens of thousands of years, and it has only existed itself for 157. It was dug by hand. It has been closed by 3 different wars. It has been fought over by 4 empires. And on an ordinary day, when no ship is sideways in the southern section, roughly 12% of everything humanity trades with itself passes through it. This is the Suez Canal. It runs in a near straight line across the Isthmus of Suez, connecting the Mediterranean Sea in the north to the Red Sea in the south. On a map, it is almost invisible, a thread of blue between 2 larger bodies of water, flanked on one side by the Sinai Peninsula and on the other by the arid flatness of northeastern Egypt. There are no locks along its length. The Mediterranean and the Red Sea sit at almost the same elevation, so the canal is simply a trench of water open to both ends, carved 24 meters deep at its center and 133 meters wide at its widest natural point. On a typical day before 2023, 50 ships passed through it. Oil tankers from the Gulf, container ships from Shanghai and Singapore, bulk carriers loaded with grain, cement, iron ore. Their cumulative weight, the dead weight of human commerce, was measured in millions of tons every 24 hours. The tolls they paid the Egyptian government amounted to more than $9 billion a year, a sum that kept Egypt's foreign currency reserves solvent and its central government functioning. canal is not a river. Nothing here flows from a source. The water in it is the Mediterranean at the north end and the Red Sea at the south end, and in the middle they meet in a set of shallow, saltwater lakes that have existed in various forms since before the pyramids. What the canal does is remove a barrier. Before 1869, a ship sailing from London to Bombay had to travel around the entire continent of Africa, a journey of more than 21,000 kilometers around the Cape of Good Hope. After 1869, that same ship could save 8,900 kilometers and 10 days of sailing by passing through a ditch in Egypt. The ditch did not change the geography of the planet, it changed the meaning of the geography. London was suddenly closer to India than it had been for centuries. Asia became a near neighbor of Europe. Oil from the Persian Gulf reached German refineries in 10 days instead of a month. And the fortunes of Egypt, a country that had been an administrative backwater of the Ottoman Empire for 300 years, became tied forever to whether the ships kept moving through that thin blue line on the map. But Egypt did not dig the canal on its own terms. And to understand what happened to the Ever Given in March of 2021, you have to understand who built the waterway that held her and what it cost the people who did the digging. The idea of cutting through the Isthmus of Suez is almost as old as Egypt itself. Around 1850 BCE, during the reign of Senuseret III of the 12th dynasty, Egyptian engineers began constructing an irrigation channel through a dry valley called Wadi Tumilat. This channel ran east from the Nile and eventually connected through a network of natural lakes to the Red Sea. It was not a sea-level canal like the one that exists today. It was a seasonal waterway, navigable during the flood season, meant to let ships sail from the Nile out into the Indian Ocean. The Egyptians called it the Canal of the Pharaohs. Around 600 BCE, the pharaoh Necho II tried to widen it into a proper year-round passage. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, 120,000 Egyptian workers died in the attempt. The project was abandoned, then completed a century later by the Persian king Darius I, who left a stone inscription near the canal's route, announcing in 4 languages that ships now sailed from Egypt through his waterway to the sea that began in Persia. The canal was reopened by Ptolemy II Philadelphus in 270 BCE. It was silted over by the time of Cleopatra, who, according to one account, attempted to drag her fleet overland across the Isthmus of Suez after losing the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE. The Romans reopened it. The Arab general Amr ibn al-Az reopened it in the 7th century, using it briefly to ship grain from Egypt to the holy cities of Arabia during a famine. And then, sometime in the 8th century, the canal was deliberately filled in on the orders of the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur, who feared that rebels in Arabia might use it to supply themselves with grain from Egypt. What had been, on and off for 2 millennia, a working passage between 2 seas, became a memory. For the next 1100 years, there was no canal. Ships sailing from Europe to India took the long way, around Africa, and the Isthmus of Suez sat in the desert as a line of dry sand between 2 seas that almost touched. The idea came back in 1798, when Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt and ordered his engineers to survey a possible canal route. The survey produced a flawed conclusion. that the Red Sea was roughly 10 meters higher than the Mediterranean, which would make a sea-level canal impossible without massive locks. The error was not corrected for another 50 years. When it was, the French idea resurfaced, and this time it belonged to a diplomat named Ferdinand de Lesseps. De Lesseps was not an engineer. He was a former French consul to Cairo who had befriended the young son of the Egyptian viceroy in the 1830s. That son, Said Pasha, came to power in 1854, and one of his first acts was to receive an old family friend at the palace in Alexandria. De Lesseps was 49 years old, recently widowed, and had left diplomacy. He brought with him an idea that had been circulating among French reformers for a decade: a sea-level canal from Port Said to Suez, open to the ships of all nations, operated for 99 years by a French-owned company, and then returned to Egypt. On November 30th, 1854, Said Pasha signed the concession. On April 25th, 1859, de Lesseps struck the first blow of the pickaxe at the northern end of the route, in a place where there was nothing yet. No port, no town, no drinking water. That place would soon be called Port Said, after the viceroy himself. The work that began there would take 10 years and cost more lives than anyone involved in the project ever fully acknowledged. The canal was dug by hand. In the first 4 years of construction, the Egyptian government under Said Pasha supplied the labor through a system called the corvée, a centuries-old practice of conscripting peasants from the Nile Delta for forced, unpaid work on state projects. Historians estimate that 400,000 Egyptian fellahin were mobilized to dig the canal. They were given food and water sufficient to survive, no wages, and tools that consisted of picks, shovels, and wicker baskets to carry sand out of the trench. They worked in heat that regularly exceeded 45 degrees. They lived in canvas shelters. Cholera broke out in 1865 and moved through the worker camps with catastrophic speed. By the most conservative estimates, tens of thousands of workers died in the first 4 years alone. The total death toll over the full 10-year project is placed by French and Egyptian historians at roughly 100,000 people. There are no individual graves. The remains of the dead were buried in mass pits in the desert near the work sites, and those pits were never marked. In the decades after the canal's opening, Egyptian writers would return to this figure, 100,000, as the foundation on which the ship lanes were laid. One Egyptian phrase from the nationalist period of the 1950s described the canal as having been dug with Egyptian picks and buried in Egyptian flesh. In 1864, under pressure from the British government, which opposed the canal on imperial grounds and condemned the use of forced labor, and from the new Egyptian ruler Ismail Pasha, Napoleon III arbitrated the dispute. The corvée was ended. European laborers from Greece, Italy, and Dalmatia were brought in to replace the fellahin. And for the first time, the project began to use machines. The dredgers arrived. Steam shovels, custom-built in French shipyards, were floated into the partially completed trench and began to dig at rates the human workers could not match. In the final 5 years of construction, the pace quadrupled. On August 15, 1869, the waters of the Red Sea met the waters of the Mediterranean for the first time in over 1,000 years in the widening of the canal called the Great Bitter Lake. On November 17, 1869, the Suez Canal opened to traffic. The ceremony lasted 3 days. Khedive Ismail, the Viceroy of Egypt, had built an opera house in Cairo specifically to host the opening, an opera house that commissioned Giuseppe Verdi to write a new work for the occasion, a piece called Aida. The guest list for the ceremony read like a directory of European royalty. The Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph attended, so did the Crown Prince of Prussia and Prince Louis of Hesse. The Empress of France, Eugénie, wife of Napoleon III, sailed through the canal on the Imperial yacht L'Aigle, which became the first ship to make the full transit from Port Said to Suez. The canal at its opening was 25 feet deep and 72 feet wide at the bottom. In its first full year of operation, fewer than 500 ships used it. But by the end of the 1870s, as the canal was widened and deepened, the number climbed into the thousands, and the geography of global trade began to rearrange itself around the new shortcut. The towns that had grown up along the canal during its construction rearranged themselves as well. Port Said, at the northern entrance, had been a worker camp of canvas tents in 1859. By 1875, it was a functioning city of 30,000 people. Greek merchants, Italian engineers, Maltese shopkeepers, Armenian clerks, French company officials, British consuls, Egyptian longshoremen, Syrian Jewish bankers. The streets were laid out on a grid. The buildings rose 3 and 4 stories, with wooden balconies supported by slender columns, a style that has survived in fragments to this day in the old quarter of Port Said. The city was one of the most cosmopolitan ports in the Mediterranean, and at the harbour mouth, on a plinth facing the sea, stood a bronze statue of Ferdinand de Lesseps, with his arm outstretched toward the canal, as though welcoming every ship that entered. The statue would stand there for almost 90 years. In 1956, during the crisis that would bear the city's name, it was pulled from its pedestal by a Port Said crowd and dragged through the streets. For decades afterward, it lay on the shore of a back harbour, face down in the sand. It has since been moved to a garden in a nearby shipyard and placed upright again, though not at its original site. The pedestal at the harbour mouth is still there, empty, covered in graffiti. 40 kilometers south of Port Said, at roughly the midpoint of the canal, another city was founded during the construction, Ismailia, named after the Khedive who ruled Egypt at the canal's opening. Ismailia was built on the western shore of a natural lake called Timsah, which in Arabic means crocodile. The lake had once been filled with Nile crocodiles before the construction dredged its banks and changed the water chemistry. By 1869, there were no crocodiles left. The name remained. Ismailia was designed, from its first street, to be a European city in the desert. The French architects of the Suez Canal Company drew it on a gridiron plan with wide avenues, tree-lined squares, and gardens modeled on the French Riviera. The headquarters of the Suez Canal Company was built there, a 2-story white building on the shore of Lake Timsah, and it remains there today, though the company is now called the Suez Canal Authority, and the building is an Egyptian state institution rather than a French corporate office. In Ismailia's early years, the city had no drinking water of its own. The Nile was 70 kilometers away, and the land between the city and the river was desert. To supply the city and the thousands of workers digging the main canal nearby, a second, smaller canal was dug in 1861 and 1862 from the Nile to Lake Timsah. It was called the Sweetwater Canal. 3,000 workers excavated 1.1 million cubic meters of earth to build it. Once it was finished, fresh water flowed east across the desert for the first time in more than 1,000 years, and towns and farms began to appear along its banks, where nothing had grown before. The Sweetwater Canal still flows. It supplies drinking water to Port Said, Ismailia, and Suez to this day. It is the reason any of those three cities exists. At the southern end of the waterway, where the canal meets the Gulf of Suez and the Red Sea beyond, sits the city of Suez itself, the oldest of the three canal towns and the only one not created from scratch by the canal's builders.
Suez had been a fishing port
and a way station for Muslim pilgrims traveling to Mecca for centuries before de Lesseps arrived. When the canal opened in 1869, a new district called Port Tufik was built at the canal's mouth to house the pilots who would guide arriving ships northward. Suez then grew outward as a refinery and shipyard town, tied to the oil trade that flowed up from the Arabian Peninsula. Suez would later pay for its position. It was bombed flat in the 1956 Suez Crisis. It was bombed again in 1967, when Israeli forces reached the eastern bank of the canal, and for 8 years afterwards, it was a frontline city, evacuated, largely abandoned, with unexploded ordnance in its streets. When residents returned in the late 1970s, they returned to a city that had to be rebuilt block by block. But the building of the canal system and the growth of the cities along it required money that Egypt did not have. By 1875, Khedive Ismail had bankrupted the Egyptian treasury on infrastructure projects: the canal, the opera house, new railroads, modernization of Cairo. To raise cash, he sold Egypt's 44% stake in the Suez Canal Company to the British government for £4 million. The transaction was arranged in secret by the British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, who wrote to Queen Victoria afterwards, "The canal is now yours, madam." It was not legally hers. The canal's territory belonged to Egypt. The company was registered under Egyptian law. But the British government was now the largest shareholder, and that was enough. 7 years later, in 1882, Britain invaded Egypt on the pretext of protecting European interests and did not leave for 74 years. British soldiers garrisoned the canal zone. British civilians ran the administration. Egyptian workers loaded and unloaded ships, manned the ferry crossings, drove the trains that ran along the canal's western bank, and watched the profits of the waterway they had built flow out to London and Paris. For 100 years after its opening, the Suez Canal was an Egyptian waterway in everything except ownership. And in the meantime, something else was happening in the canal, something slow and invisible and irreversible. When the Mediterranean and the Red Sea were joined in 1869, they brought with them not just ships, but entire ecosystems. The Red Sea is warm, saline, and richly biodiverse, a tropical marine system connected to the Indian Ocean. The Mediterranean is cooler, less saline in its eastern basin, and comparatively sparse in species. For 10 million years before 1869, the two seas had been separated by 100 kilometers of Egyptian desert, and their marine life had evolved in complete isolation from each other. Within a decade of the canal's opening, Red Sea species began to appear in the Mediterranean. Biologists call it the Lessepian migration, named after Ferdinand de Lesseps. It is the largest human-caused shift in marine biogeography in recorded history. As of the latest surveys, more than 1,000 species from the Red Sea and the Indo-Pacific have established themselves in the Mediterranean by passing through the canal. Small fish first, gobies and cardinal fish in the 1880s and 1890s. Then, larger species: rabbitfish, barracuda, silver-cheeked toadfish, cornet fish. Then, in the last 20 years, the arrivals have accelerated. More new fish species reached the Mediterranean in the first 2 decades of the 21st century than in the entire previous century combined. The marbled rabbitfish, a small herbivorous Red Sea fish, was first recorded in the eastern Mediterranean in 1927. Today, along the Israeli and Lebanese coasts, rabbitfish make up 87% of the herbivore biomass in shallow water. They graze in dense shoals, consuming algae at rates the native fish cannot match. Algal forests that supported whole food webs have been reduced to bare rock in a single generation. Biologists who have dived the same sites for 30 years report underwater landscapes they no longer recognize. The lionfish arrived in 2012. Native to the Indo-Pacific with venomous spines and no natural predators in the Mediterranean, a mature female lionfish lays 50,000 eggs every 3 days. Within a decade, populations had established themselves from Cyprus and Lebanon to the waters off Sicily. The silver-cheeked toadfish came in the early 2000s. It carries tetrodotoxin in its flesh and liver, a neurotoxin more potent than cyanide, with no known antidote. Fishermen in the eastern Mediterranean have been poisoned by it. In some countries, catching it is now illegal because there is no safe way to sell it. The 2015 expansion of the canal, a 35-kilometer parallel channel dug in a single year to allow two-way traffic through the middle section, doubled the rate at which Red Sea species can cross into the Mediterranean. Marine biologists protested the project publicly. The Egyptian government responded that economic necessity outweighed ecological concern. The channel was dug on schedule. The species continued to arrive. The canal is still there, so is the water. So now are the rabbitfish and the lionfish and the toadfish and whatever will arrive next. But the canal's deepest transformations have not been ecological. They have been political. On the afternoon of July 26, 1956, a crowd gathers in Manshia Square in Alexandria to hear the Egyptian president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, give a speech marking the 4th anniversary of the revolution that overthrew King Farouk. Nasser is 38 years old. He has been in power for 3 years. He speaks for almost 3 hours, standing in an open-topped podium on a warm summer evening, his voice amplified through loudspeakers that reach the edges of the square. In the middle of the speech, he begins to talk about the Aswan Dam, a massive hydroelectric project that Egypt needs to irrigate new farmland and generate power. The United States and Britain had promised to finance it. A week earlier, they had withdrawn the offer, citing concerns about Egypt's growing relationship with the Soviet Union. Nasser tells the crowd that Egypt will pay for the dam itself. He tells them how. As he speaks, he uses the name Ferdinand de Lesseps. He uses it not once, but 13 times. The name is a code. Egyptian military units stationed near the Suez Canal has been told that when they hear the name de Lesseps spoken over the radio, they are to move on the canal company's offices in Port Said, Ismailia, and Suez and seize them. By the time the speech ends, the Suez Canal belongs to the Egyptian state. In London, the Nationalization is treated as an act of war. In Paris, the same. Prime Minister Anthony Eden of Britain reportedly tells his cabinet that Nasser must be destroyed. Within weeks, the British, French, and Israeli governments begin secret planning for a coordinated military operation. Israel will invade the Sinai Peninsula, threatening the canal. Britain and France will step in as supposed peacekeepers, occupy the canal zone, and depose Nasser. On October 29, 1956, Israel invades Sinai and advances within 10 miles of the canal. On November 5th, British and French paratroopers land at Port Said. The city is bombed. Civilian casualties are extensive. The British Army expects resistance to collapse within days. It does not. Port Said fights back street by street. Egyptian soldiers and armed civilians defend the same harbor where de Lesseps's statue had stood for 87 years. The statue is pulled down in the middle of the fighting, and while the military operation begins to succeed, the canal zone is partially occupied, Egyptian forces are pushed back. The political situation collapses. The United States, under President Eisenhower, refuses to support the invasion. The Soviet Union threatens direct intervention. Oil shortages begin in Britain as the canal is blocked by sunken ships. Within a week, the British pound is in crisis. Eisenhower tells the British government that the United States will not help stabilize the currency unless British troops withdraw from Egypt immediately. They withdraw. So do the French. So, eventually, does Israel. By the end of December 1956, the invasion force is gone. Nasser has kept the canal. Britain's status as a global superpower built on a century of imperial dominance has ended in 6 weeks. The canal is closed for 5 months while the sunken ships are cleared. When it reopens in April of 1957, it opens under Egyptian control for the first time since 1869. It has never changed hands again. In Port Said today, the pedestal where the de Lesseps statue stood is still empty. The graffiti on it has been repainted many times. The new paint rarely lasts. For 10 years after the Suez Crisis, the canal ran through a peace that everyone in Egypt understood was temporary. Israeli and Egyptian forces faced off across the Sinai. The canal ferried goods. Port Said was rebuilt, and in the early hours of June 5, 1967, the peace ended. The Six-Day War began with an Israeli airstrike that destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the ground in the first morning. By the third day, Israeli forces had crossed the Sinai Peninsula and reached the eastern bank of the Suez Canal. Egypt, unable to hold the line, did what it had done in 1956. It blocked the canal at both ends with scuttled ships and mines to prevent its use. On the morning of June 5th, 15 merchant ships were sailing northbound through the canal, carrying cargo from Asia and the Indian Ocean to European ports. When the canal was closed, they had nowhere to go. Their captains were instructed to drop anchor in the widest part of the waterway, the Great Bitter Lake, a shallow saltwater lake roughly 100 square kilometers in area, flanked on its eastern side by the Sinai Desert and on its western side by a flat Egyptian plain. The ships would remain there for 8 years, 3 months, and 5 days. They were from 8 countries, 4 from Britain, 2 from West Germany, 2 from Sweden, 2 from Poland, 1 each from the United States, France, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia. Their crews, numbering in the hundreds at first, did not know when they would go home. The Egyptian government did not know when the canal could be reopened. Outside the lake, on both banks, artillery positions faced each other across open water, and raiding parties sometimes slipped across at night. To the east of the Bitter Lake, the Sinai Peninsula, a triangle of desert bounded by the Mediterranean to the north, the Red Sea to the south, and the canal to the west, was now occupied by Israeli forces. Bedouin tribes who had grazed camels on its plateaus for centuries found themselves living inside an active military zone. Dirt tracks that had connected oases and shrines were marked off with mines. The monastery of St. Catherine at the peninsula's southern end, built by order of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian in the 6th century and continuously inhabited by Orthodox monks ever since, continued its daily services within sight of Israeli military patrols throughout the entire 8 years of occupation.
In October of 1967,
4 months into the trapping, the officers and crews of the 14 ships in the Great Bitter Lake met aboard the British ship Melampus and founded what they called the Great Bitter Lake Association. Captain Jim Starkey of the British freighter Port Invercargill was elected its life president. They established rules, a constitution, a yacht club. They began to organize the time. The British ship hosted football matches on its flat foredeck. The West German ship hosted Sunday church services. The Bulgarian ship had a film projector and became the cinema. The Swedish ship had a swimming pool and became the pool. The Polish ship ran the galley. The crews visited each other by lifeboat, crossing the salt water between ships with bottles of schnapps and wine from home. The desert wind blew sand over the decks every night, and by the end of the first year, the hulls had turned the color of the surrounding landscape. Sailors in the Mediterranean began to call them the Yellow Fleet. In October of 1968, to coincide with the Summer Olympics in Mexico City, the crews of the Yellow Fleet held their own games, the Bitter Lake Olympic Games. 14 events, lifeboat races, sailing, swimming, diving, archery, high jump, shooting, soccer, water polo. 8 countries competed. The medals were handcrafted from scrap metal. Poland finished first. West Germany finished second. Britain finished third. The closing ceremony was held on the Port Invercargill under a flag sewn from signal bunting. The association ran its own postal system. Members designed and printed postage stamps by hand, small rectangles with portraits of the ships, seabirds, and the initials GBLA. The Egyptian government, in a gesture that was half humorous and half pragmatic, agreed to honor the stamps on outgoing mail. A letter franked at the Great Bitter Lake in 1969 would be delivered to England, or to West Germany, or to the United States. The stamps became collector's items within a decade and remain among the most prized pieces of maritime philately. By 1969, it became clear that the canal would not reopen soon. The ship owners negotiated an arrangement. Full crews would be replaced with small caretaker teams, rotated every 3 months, so the rest of the men could go home. The ships were lashed together into 3 clusters to reduce the caretaker workload. The sailors went back to their families. Some of them never saw the Great Bitter Lake again. Others returned on rotation year after year. In October of 1973, the Yom Kippur War began. Egyptian forces crossed the canal into Sinai. Israeli airstrikes targeted the canal zone. The American ship African Glen, moored in the Great Bitter Lake, was sunk when it was used as an Egyptian observation post. It remains the only Yellow Fleet vessel lost in combat. In early 1975, the war settled into a negotiated peace. Egypt began clearing the canal. On May 24, 1975, the 2 West German ships Münsterland and Nordwind sailed out of the Great Bitter Lake, up the canal, into the Mediterranean, and home to Hamburg, under their own power, after 8 years, 3 months, and 5 days at sea. 30,000 people lined the docks of Hamburg to see them return. They were the only 2 ships of the Yellow Fleet to leave the lake on their own engines. The rest were towed. By the time they reached home port, the world had moved on. Container shipping had revolutionized cargo transport during the years the Yellow Fleet sat idle. Their holds, built for bulk goods and mixed freight, were obsolete. Within a year of their return, most were scrapped. The canal reopened to international traffic on June 5, 1975, 8 years to the day after it had closed. And for nearly half a century afterward, it worked as it had been intended to work. Ships moved. Tolls were collected. Egypt captains piloted foreign vessels through the Narrows. The desert on either side was quiet. But the ships were changing. In 1969, the largest container ship in service held 1,500 standard containers. By 2000, the largest held 8,000. By 2015, the largest held 18,000. By 2020, the largest held 24,000. The canal's dimensions were not changing at the same pace. The Suez Canal Authority had widened and deepened the waterway 3 times, in 1954, in 1980, and in 2015. But each expansion lagged the growth of the ships using it. By the late 2000s and 10s, a fully loaded Suezmax container vessel at 400 meters long and 59 meters wide fit into the canal's single-lane southern section with roughly 30 meters of clearance on each side. Maritime engineers had been warning about this for years. An OECD report in 2015 described the trend of ship gigantism as a complete disconnect of ship-size development from developments in the actual economy. A Lloyd's List analysis noted that ships had outgrown the infrastructure that was supposed to move them. The risk was not theoretical. Narrow waterways magnify every pilot error. Strong crosswinds on a container ship with high deck stacks produce lateral forces that can overwhelm a rudder. And in the southern section of the Suez Canal, there is no room to recover from a mistake. On the morning of March 23, 2021, every one of those conditions was present. The Ever Given had departed from Malaysia 3 weeks earlier, bound for Rotterdam with 20,000 containers on her deck. She was operated by the Taiwanese shipping line Evergreen, owned by a Japanese leasing company, managed technically by a German firm, flagged in Panama. Crewed by Indian and Filipino sailors under an Indian captain, Krishnan Kanthavel. She was, in every sense, a ship of no single nation, one of hundreds moving cargo between Asia and Europe on a schedule measured in hours. She entered the southern stretch of the canal at dawn on March 23rd. A sandstorm was moving up the Red Sea. The Suez Canal Authority's meteorological warnings had been posted for the previous 12 hours, but traffic had not been halted. The authorities' standard procedure was to allow transit in sandstorm conditions with the ship's captain's discretion. The Ever Given's pilots decided to proceed. At 7:40, visibility drops below 300 meters. The wind rises to 50 kilometers per hour from the south. The Ever Given's hull, with containers stacked 12 high, presents an enormous lateral surface to the wind. More than 20,000 square meters of steel box catching the storm. She begins to drift to port. The pilots order a course correction. The rudder responds. She drifts again. They order another correction opposite the first. The ship's rate of turn becomes unstable. The engines are called for more power to regain steerage, pushing her speed to 13.5 knots, nearly twice the safe transit speed in the narrow channel. At 7:42, she yaws 90 degrees across the canal. Her bow, weighing tens of thousands of tons, drives into the eastern bank. Her stern settles into the western bank. The rudder is out of the water. The propeller is buried in sand. The containers above her do not shift. They are lashed for rough seas. But the ship herself is locked, held between both continents by her own weight and the soft canal banks that will not release her. Within an hour, the Suez Canal Authority suspends all transit in both directions. By that evening, 50 ships are waiting at the northern entrance and 30 at the southern. By the end of the next day, the queue has doubled. By March 28th, 5 days into the blockage, more than 430 vessels are anchored at Port Said and at the Gulf of Suez, carrying oil, grain, containers, chemicals, auto parts, and passengers. Some ships, unable to wait, begin diverting around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 10 days and 4,000 miles to their voyages at a fuel cost of roughly $1 million per round trip. The BBC estimates the cost of the blockage at $6.7 million per minute. Insurance analysts at Lloyd's of London calculate the daily cost at $9.6 billion. A later study by an international research team puts total global economic damage from the 6-day stoppage at $136 billion, with India, dependent on European raw materials, bearing 3/4 of the loss. The salvage effort begins almost immediately. The Suez Canal Authority contracts the Dutch firm Royal Boskalis through its subsidiary Smit International. Tugboats arrive from Egyptian ports, dredgers begin excavating the banks to release the bow. And on the shore of the canal, a single yellow excavator, a piece of ordinary construction equipment weighing perhaps 8 tons, drives down to the water's edge and begins scraping sand away from the nose of a ship 200,000 tons heavier than itself. The image of that excavator, photographed from above, becomes the defining image of the incident. It circulates globally within hours, a small yellow dot at the foot of a wall of steel, scraping at a mountain with a spoon. For many people who will never read a maritime news article, that image is how they first learn that the Suez Canal exists. By March 27th, 4 days in, the ship has not moved. 13 tugs are working her. Dredgers have removed 30,000 cubic meters of sand from beneath her bow. Her weight is being reduced through ballast pumping, and the calendar is approaching a full moon. The moon matters. A full moon in the Suez Canal produces spring tides, the highest tides of the month, and the canal's water level rises by roughly half a meter at the peak. The salvage team schedules the primary refloating attempt for the night of March 28th into 29th, when the tide will be at its highest. At 2 a.m. on March 29th, 18 tugboats pull together. The stern shifts. At 3 a.m., the bow releases from the eastern bank. At 4 a.m., the Ever Given floats free for the first time in almost 6 days. Flares are fired from the tugs. A cheer goes up from the crews on the canal banks. Crews of Egyptian dredger operators and Dutch salvage engineers and Royal Navy liaison officers, all of whom have been working without sleep. The ship is towed to the Great Bitter Lake for inspection. The canal reopens by mid-morning. Ships begin transiting in both directions. The backlog is cleared by April 3rd. On April 13th, Egypt impounds the Ever Given in the Great Bitter Lake and demands $900 million in compensation for salvage costs, lost canal revenue, and damage to the waterway. The dispute is settled in late June for an undisclosed sum estimated at around $500 million. The ship is released. She continues to Rotterdam, more than 3 months late. The canal, the Egyptian authorities announce, has returned to full operation. For 2 years, it did. In November of 2023, in response to the war in Gaza, the Yemen-based Houthi movement begins launching missiles and drones at merchant ships transiting the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow passage between Yemen and Djibouti that forms the southern gateway to the Red Sea and, by extension, to the Suez Canal. By early 2024, more than 190 attacks have been recorded. 4 ships have been sunk. 9 sailors have been killed. Major container shipping lines, Maersk, MSC, Hapag-Lloyd, CMA-CGM, suspend their Red Sea services. Ships are rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 10 to 14 days to each voyage between Asia and Europe. Container traffic through the Suez Canal falls 90% in the first 3 months of 2024, compared with the same period the year before. By 2025, the decline stabilizes but does not reverse. Suez Canal revenues for the fourth quarter of 2024 come in at $880 million, down from $2.4 billion in the same quarter the year before. The Egyptian government, already running a foreign currency shortage, loses an estimated $8 billion in canal receipts over 18 months. 40% more fuel is required by a round trip around Africa. Transit times from China to Europe approach 2 months on key lanes. In Port Said, ship traffic has thinned. In Ismailia, at the headquarters of the Suez Canal Authority, Chairman Osama Rabi, the same official who held the Ever Given press conferences in 2021, now holds weekly press conferences on vessel returns. Chinese shipping lines have not abandoned the canal. Some European lines have begun tentative returns, but the traffic has not come back in full. In the villages along the Sweetwater Canal, the farmers notice the same thing they noticed during the 1967 closure. The river of ships has thinned to a trickle. The canal, in other words, is still there. The water still connects 2 seas. The banks have not collapsed. The infrastructure works as it was designed to. What has gone is the certainty that it will be used. The assumption, held for decades, that the most important shortcut on Earth is safe to take. There is something Egyptians who live along the canal say when asked about all of this. It goes something like, "The canal has been empty before. It was empty for 8 years when the Yellow Fleet sat in the Bitter Lake. It was empty for 5 months after the Suez Crisis. It was empty for centuries after the Abbasids filled it in. The canal is patient. The ships will come back. Or they won't. Either way, the water will still be here. Whether they are right is one of the open questions of the present moment. The thin blue line on the map runs from Port Said to Suez, through Ismailia, through Lake Timsah and the Great Bitter Lake, past the scrub and the date palms and the desert where 100,000 fellahin are buried in unmarked pits. It has survived 3 wars, 4 empires, 2 closures, 1 60-year occupation, and a container ship that wedged herself sideways across its southern mouth for 6 days in 2021. It will survive whatever is coming next. The ships that pass through it will keep changing. The world that needs those ships to pass will keep changing. And the canal, dug by hand, held open by pressure, and emptied now by a war it did not start, will keep being here. 193 kilometers of open water between 2 continents, waiting for the next century of traffic to decide whether it still wants to use it. Thanks for watching. If you found this journey worthwhile, consider subscribing, and we'll meet you again on the next one.